Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our panel on a hybrid future of work. As you will see, the panel we have with us today is hybrid as well, as we have some guests who are joining us in the studio today and some guests who are joining us online. And this is quite characteristic for what is happening in workplaces across Europe today. More and more workers are returning to the office, some because they cannot wait to be back with their co-workers, and others because their employer is asking them to come back. However, the return has been quite slow, and it seems like we will not be returning completely to the full-time office presence that we were used to before the pandemic. And why should we? The past couple of years have shown us that flexible working is possible to a much greater extent than we previously thought feasible. And now that we've had a taste of the benefits that telework brings in terms of work-life balance, commuting time, and autonomy, it's hard to let go of. Some workers would rather quit their jobs than return to the office full-time, although most of us do value being in the office at least part of the week. So surveys show that more than half of office workers would like to keep working remotely at least 3 days a week, although other studies show that this is technically only feasible for about a quarter of the workforce in Europe. So these numbers show that fully remote work is not only not feasible for all jobs, it's also not desired by all workers. So many companies will likely adopt a hybrid combination of remote work and office work, where some employees are working from home, others are working in the office, and a majority might choose their location for different days of the week. And while this hybrid future creates opportunities for geographic mobility in Europe and for reducing regional inequalities, there will definitely be some challenges to overcome, both in finding and transitioning to a new hybrid way of working. We see that now is a time of experimentation in which both companies and workers are trying to find a new balance. Companies are balancing the flexibility of the individual worker with the functioning of the organization as a collective whole. Teleworkers or workers are trying to find a new balance that combines the benefits of telework with also the opportunities that being in the office brings for your career. And during this time of experimentation, we need to make sure that we settle on a new equilibrium that takes into account the interests of employers and employees alike. Employers might be worried about productivity or collaboration within teams or innovation that happens across teams and departments, while teleworkers might worry about excessive monitoring or the expectation to be always connected or the loss of career opportunities compared with office workers. So the question we want to discuss here today is whether there is scope for European policy to play a role in finding this new hybrid equilibrium. The current framework agreement on telework was signed by the European social partners in 2002, meaning that it's almost 20 years old. It contains a number of measures to protect teleworkers, but its implementation has not been uniform across the EU, meaning leaving Europe with a legislative patchwork of regional, national and local laws, as well as sectoral and company-level agreements. But most of all, technology and worker preferences have changed so much in the past 20 years that the telework agreement is just due for an update. It's an opportunity to harmonize standards in the EU single market while facilitating the implementation of flexible working conditions for employers and ensuring minimum protection for on-site and teleworkers alike. So to discuss this topic today, we have with us two people who deal with hybrid working in the workplace on a daily basis, and they will share with us the main challenges that they encounter. And we also have two people from the European institutions who can share with us the response of EU policymakers on the need and scope for regulating hybrid work. So let me introduce our panel for today. We have Renske Paens. She's the Chief HR Officer at Randstad, a multinational HR services company that employs 30,000 people globally directly and puts another 500,000 people to work in other companies on a daily basis. Like most office work in Europe, Randstad switched to telework at the start of the pandemic, and Renske is here with us today to share the challenges that brought with it. Then we have Julie Brophy. She's a principal consultant in the organization development practice of OE Cambridge, where she works where she works with executives and senior leaders. During the initial stages of the pandemic, she focused on helping leaders understand the needs of a remote workforce, and more recently, she helps organizations to identify and mitigate the unforeseen circumstances of hybrid working. From the European Parliament, we have Alex Saliba. He serves on the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, for whom he's reporting on the Digital Services Act, and also on the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs, for whom he's reporting on the right to disconnect. And last but not least, from the European Commission, we are delighted to have in the studio live with us here today, Joost Korte, Director General of DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. He's highly experienced in EU decision-making and has served in several DGs, including DG Trade, DG Agriculture and Development, and DG Neighborhood and Enlargement. Finally, I would like to welcome the audience we have with us today, and I would like to invite you to ask questions on Slido. Go to www.slide.do and use the code Telework. So a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm very pleased to have such an excellent panel here today. And let's dive right into the opening statements. Renske, let me start with you. As a Chief HR Officer of a company that switched to remote work during the pandemic, what were the main challenges for your employees and your teams to adapt to this new way of working?
Thank you. Well, there were a number of challenges indeed. And of course, from our positioning that we both have, exactly as you said, some, well, even 40,000 employees working for us directly, and indeed having our talents or employees working for our clients. We had several challenges, especially at the beginning of the crisis. And there we found ourselves not so much with difficulty of getting our own workers, so our own consultants, getting to work virtually or from home, because actually we managed to do that, I would even say within, well, 24, maybe 48 hours. So that went remarkably smooth. We could work from home with all of our workforce really within a day. So that went even faster than we thought ourselves. Our first focus then really was, and that's something that we've, of course, as a leader in the private employment services sector, we really focused on first and foremost is making sure that there was a safe return to work for our workers that worked for our clients. And there already you see, and you also commented on it, there's quite a big difference then on people that work in offices and people that work on premises and have more blue collar related work. So I think still that is something that we really need to realize that the difference is quite big into what type of possibilities you can create for one or the other. We then focused on getting people safely back to work on those work floors in making sure that we leveraged our expertise in health and safety protocols across countries and industries, combining best practices. It's not so much that Randstad ourselves, we are that expert in health and safety, but we are in the position to really have workers and connect to our clients and our candidates across all those industries and compile best practices and create, in that sense, new channels to scale effective protocols at speed. So we set up the Safely Back to Work Alliance in March 2020 with some other leading HR industry partners. And that was for us our first focus and our biggest challenge, I guess. We reviewed over 400 health and safety protocols from 5 sectors in the beginning. Sectors like transport, logistics, automotive, manufacturing, life sciences, construction, food in 13 countries and developed a fact-based. And I think for us, that was the most important thing to make sure that our people could do their work again. I think looking at how quickly we went to work ourselves as Randstad and looking at how quickly we then could recover. In April 2020, 150,000 of our talents, as we call them, so our candidates that we put to work with our clients, all lost their jobs. And in 6 months' time, our consultants were able to bring 142,000 of those talents back to work. And I think that for us was proof of how quickly we could ramp things up, working from a distance, no longer in our offices and in the branches. But you could also see there, because we are present in 40 countries, you could see some differences across the globe. So although technically it was, well, I don't want to say easy, but it was relatively easy to get our people to work, there's also the issue of, do you have enough trust that indeed employees will be able to pick up their daily performance as they did before when they did work in the office. One example, for instance, was, and well, that's outside of Europe, but still I think it's an interesting example to look at, was for instance, Japan. We're quite big in Japan. So we have quite some workers there, also our own consultants, and there no one was used to work from home ever, not one day a week. And now they were forced, as I also saw in the outset of the conference, that because people are forced, now they really started to work from home. And then that does open, I think, avenues where people see that this actually can be done, and the trust in that sense grew. Also within Europe, you saw big differences. In the Netherlands, it was relatively easy. The levels of working from home were already quite high, so people were used to this. If you compare that to, for us, so for Randstad ourselves, our own workers, the 40,000 in total. In France and Italy, that was different. That was really starting from the outset. And again, there, I think we've really opened the avenue. And indeed, we do see in, I would say, every operating company, every country that we are in, we have decided once those opportunities are totally there and people can totally come back into the office, to indeed adopt a hybrid way of working and not come totally back. And the challenges you see, apart from the trust component, that I think is the most important component actually from a management and leadership perspective. There's also the ED&I, so equity, diversity and inclusion component, especially the inclusion part. You do see that, especially when you onboard new employees, it is harder to make them part of your company culture, I think, and bringing your values across, seeing how certain things are being done in its entirety, really feeling part of a company, of its total, and creating that line of sight. So what do you do in relation to what the company is trying to achieve as a collective? Well-being, work-life balance, very big challenge, and that grew bigger and bigger as the COVID pandemic went on longer. So we really had to do interventions there, making sure that people were clear on having boundaries, when to stop, and making sure that people are clear on not to expect responding to emails within the same day, not planning their full day full of meetings. So that definitely has been a challenge. And of course, if you look at hybrid working and you look at the bites part, so setting everybody up to work from a distance, which for us was not the biggest issue. The bricks part, so setting up your offices in such a way that when people do come in, they can work together, because that is the main reason to come into the office, so work as a team collectively. And the behavior part, and that's where the change management comes in. And again, there I want to emphasize also, if you look, for instance, at the McKinsey research, and it's something that I do also recognize in Randstad, is that there is a bit of a gap between what C-suite management, so really senior level management, expects how much we will return back to work as it was, and what employees indeed want to and expect. And I think that gap really consciously needs to be closed. We need to be aware that there's a difference in expectation, and that we need to start to lead differently.
Great. Thank you, Renske. I took note of your challenges, being the trust issues, the EDI, well-being, work-life balance, and then the differences in expectations between employers and employees. That I hope we can make some part in contributing some part in overcoming those differences. Thank you. Julie, I would like to ask you to speak next. As a consultant, you've worked with many companies that have implemented hybrid working. So what were the main challenges that you observed for employers and managers in making the switch successful?
Yeah, to do this, I'm just going to share some slides because there are some frameworks that we've been using and developing with our clients as we go through this, because I think, as Penska said, she saw that in different countries, there's no one rule. That applies to organizations. So we've been working with organizations that have said, we're just going to let it organically happen. We've also been working with organizations who've actually said, no, we want everyone back in 3 days a week or 2 days a week. So I don't think there's one model at all of what hybrid actually means in organizations. So, okay, if everyone can see that. So I think the 3 main themes that have been coming out for us are really sort of, what are the reasons for bringing people back into work? What are the reasons that they need to be in a shared working environment? Second one is really about what is the role of leadership in hybrid workplace, and actually working with leaders to understand how it's going to be different, not just from how it was before the pandemic, but how it was after lockdown. And then the third point is really, well, how do we learn from this? So I think there's a real recognition. We've never done this before. We've never come back to work after a pandemic before. So we're not going to get it right first time. So how can we actually learn from what we're implementing and quickly react to it and then just make changes and reinforce things? So the first thing we really want to talk about is what are the key benefits of bringing people back to work? As Penska said, you know, we've worked very successfully for 18 months, 2 years remotely. Businesses have delivered what they needed to do. So why do we want to bring people back? And from our perspective and the work that we've done and some research that we did also on digital organizations that were already going more towards a hybrid model before the pandemic, is there really 4 areas that need the kind of energy and immediacy of being in an office together. And the first one of those is collaboration. Now, obviously, during the pandemic, organizations have worked successfully, they've collaborated together, but there are some particular objectives, such as if we have a particularly tight deadline, or we have a lot of people who need to be involved in that collaboration, where bringing people together actually speeds that up and builds on that interaction that they have together. So we would say the first one is collaboration. The second one we would say is creativity. Nicholas Bloom, who is an economics lecturer at Stanford and a very big advocate of flexible working, says this is one area that we really need to be concerned about, because are we going to be as productive as organizations in 2 or 3 years' time? And the thing about creativity is we can get together on screens, you know, Zooms, Teams, Blue Jeans, all of these mechanisms mean that we can come together. But creativity is not linear, almost like the conversations that we have in a VC conference. You know, creativity comes from somebody saying something and somebody picking up and building on it. And that's more difficult when the interaction is on a very small screen and we're all being very polite and waiting for other people to stop speaking so that we can come in with our ideas. So the linear nature of VC actually, I think, impacts creativity a lot. The third one is around complex decision making. So we can have processes for decision making, but actually when you're in the real world, that's not really when decisions are made. So there are lots of conversations or testing out how people think about it. There are the ad hoc asides about what's going into the decision. But also when you're making a critical decision, you can actually read the body language of people in the room. So we're finding that some of the organizations we're working with are saying, yes, we are making decisions, but we're not quite sure if they're as effective as they were, because we're not doing that ad hoc sense checking around the decision. And then I think the fourth one is culture, and that's maintaining that sense of what are we like as an organization? How do we work together? And how do we socialize? As Penska said, how do we socialize new people into our culture, into the way that we work, the way that we talk to each other? How do we share the stories that are about our organization? So when we're talking with organizations at the moment, one of the things we're finding is they need to be quite clear about why they're bringing people back into the organization, because if people are still have a caution about it, then the organization really needs to be quite clear about why they're bringing them back. And we've been working with organizations around this framework to actually say, well, actually just review, why are you coming into the office? Why do you want these people back together? But also some of the challenges from them is mainly around, why is culture, why is coming back together just to be together a key factor? And it is that socialization, but it's also just thinking about building on Penska's point about well-being. Is a lot of senior managers are in the nice position of having a bigger house, they've got space, they can work in the office. And we're finding with a lot of younger people who are more junior in the organization that actually they don't. They might live in a shared house, they might still be living at home. And that view that we have this nice office isn't where they are. So they really want to come back. So I think that's the first point that we're seeing as a theme coming through with organizations. The second one is really about how does that role change for leaders? And we're looking at 4 areas here. And one is kind of clearing the way. And that's about giving focus and perspective to people so they really know what their role is and the part that they're playing in delivering it around the organization. So for leaders, it's about giving clarity. It's about being clear who is involved in activities. And it's really kind of setting that vision so that people can really understand where they're going. The second one is around autonomy, because with most of the organizations we've been talking about, when the pandemic hit and everyone had to go remote, a lot of the control got sucked back up into the center. And so there's a lot of decision making being done from the center, which, because we were in crisis, was perfectly natural. But as people got used to working remotely, they're used to having more autonomy. So they're actually having much more control over not necessarily what I do, but the way that I do it, when I do it, and how I do it. So when organizations start to go back, leaders are going to have to be quite cautious about how much they take back that autonomy, and moving away from kind of more a command and control view that we had at the beginning of the pandemic, and much more being about putting that autonomy down and delegating. I think the third area that we've really been talking about in terms of leadership is providing attachment so that people feel part of something. You know, we've all been very disconnected from our organizations, and kind of depending on how much cultural capital we took away with us when we went into working remotely, depends how much we still feel connected. I know Penska gave us an example earlier, but I've got an opposite example where an organization I know that I've been working with had a great culture, and actually people took lower salaries because of that culture. But when that culture was taken away, they're now going, why am I working here? One of the great benefits of being in this organization isn't available to me. And they've actually had quite a lot of resignations at the moment. So it's about that attachment. It's about feeling part of it. And I think one of the things that's different about hybrid working for everybody working remotely is that everyone was in the same situation. Whereas when you're working hybrid and you've got people in the office, you form an in-group. We are the people in the office. We have present privilege. We can have side conversations. An example of this is one of the organizations we work with were having a meeting. Some were in the office and some were remote. And the people who were working remotely noticed that there were side conversations going on. When they went away for coffee and came back, the decision had been made. So they hadn't been involved in the decision. So leaders have to be really careful that they're not reinforcing in groups and out groups or any of the unconscious bias that comes along with that. And then I think the last one really about leadership is the point that Penska was making about well-being and health. What we have noticed is that because people aren't getting those ad hoc reinforcements about their performance, you know, you're doing really well, or that was a great job, thank you very much. They're becoming quite negative about their own performance. They're challenging whether or not they're doing a good job. So leaders need to really be aware of this kind of negative mindset that people are getting in, and be very positive and be reinforcing and use positively biased language when they're talking to people, so they're reconnecting them. So that's the second one. And then the third one, is kind of the final point, and people are only just beginning to really think about this, which is about the test, learn, and adapt. So as I said, there's no one solution to this. We are not going to get it right first time. We've been working with organizations to simulate what hybrid working might be for them, to try and get away from as many issues as possible, but we won't really know how it's going to work until we get in there. So we need to really test how things are going. We need to learn from that. So what's the regular way that we're going to talk to people? How are we going to find out how they're feeling? What's working well? What are we going to learn from it? And then how are we going to change? But not think that cycle is a one cycle. Actually, we're going to need to do this again and again and again until we really get this hybrid working bedded down, and we get the new behaviors and new ways of working. So just to summarize, I would say those are the three themes that are really coming through from the organizations who are all applying different hybrid working models.
Great. Thank you, Julie. What I'm taking from your presentation is the dangers related to collaboration and creativity, and what that might mean for innovation in organizations, but also the importance of attachment, or the opposite spectrum, the isolation of teleworkers and the exclusion of teleworkers in decision making. Thank you. So now I'd like to turn to Alex. Alex, after hearing Rensken and Julie from the field, can you share with us what are the biggest concerns for legislators, both at the EU and the national levels, when it comes to telework and hybrid work specifically?
First of all, good afternoon, and thanks for this invite. It's been already a very interesting conversation, touching upon different issues on the hybrid future of work. And I think that the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, why are we here today? Why are we basically discussing this issue? And we are here today because basically the COVID pandemic has prompted the governments to take, I must say, unprecedented steps of shutting down workplaces for the first time, apart basically from those who are providing essential goods or essential services in order to provide and help our society and our communities to control the spread of the virus. And every worker who was able to do so began to work from home, their majority for the firm for the first time, and inadvertently beginning and initiating a social experiment of, I must say, unprecedented kind and an unprecedented scale. And the world of work will never be the same again. And that is why we as legislators have to act today and not tomorrow to prepare ourselves for what is going to come and what is already happening. And as I said, the COVID pandemic has accelerated this transition from a regular, bureaucratic, factory-based organization of work to one which is based on a more flexible organization of working time and also organization of place. In short, creating a new working environment. Teleworking and flexi-working arrangements have undergone unprecedented expansion during the pandemic, and the chances are today that a large number of work processes will continue to be carried out remotely, even after the end of the pandemic. Now, more people are working from their homes than that of any time since basically the Industrial Revolution. And post-pandemic, more hybrid working patterns are likely to emerge with higher levels of take-up of remote working time than what was the case basically prior to the start of the COVID pandemic. Many employers are starting also to recognize the potential of digital tools, the potential of telework as a means to enhance business resilience in the face of disruptive situations that can also happen in the future. Recent news about what companies basically are announcing of extension of work from home policies, with some even deciding to allow employees to work from home permanently. We had case studies such as that of Twitter, Facebook, Shopify, and Coinbase, who came out publicly announcing basically a long-term shift to permanent telework while claiming that the office-centric approach is basically a thing of the past already. According also to a recent survey, 80% of European employers require or are considering to require more employees to work remotely once the pandemic is over. And therefore, here we are not today dealing only with the direct effect of the pandemic and how it is affecting our working environment during an emergency crisis, but basically how the future of work will be evolving when the pandemic will be over. The WEF report basically is stating that 84% of employers are set to move quickly to digitalize working processes, including the significant expansion of remote work, potentially moving 44% of their workforce to operate remotely. And this is not a joke in the future of work environment. Countries, companies, and employees will experience a continued process of adaptation of more flexible ways of work with digital tools. It is in this context that some working arrangements will basically crystallize while others will become residual. There is no doubt that digitalization and digital tools have brought many new opportunities for workers, but at the same time, today we have more new challenges at hand, such as the constant pressure of always being reachable, of always being available, basically at any time, 24/7. Digital tools have created this digital obesity that can intensify work, extend working hours with a detrimental effect on the basic, most fundamental rights of our workers: fair working condition, fair remuneration, and also working time and work-life balance, health and safety at work, and also negative effects on equality between men and women at work. And the constant connectivity, connected and combined with high job demands and the rising expectation that workers are reachable at any time, can negatively affect workers' fundamental rights and their physical and also mental well-being. Eurofound data shows that people who regularly work from home are more than twice as likely to surpass the maximum limit established by national and European legislation of 48 hours per week compared to those working from their employer's premises, and are less likely to have access to the legally mandated 11 hours of minimum daily rest. So here we are speaking of an evolution which can basically do away with the most basic, with the most fundamental rights that our forefathers have basically fought so hard to achieve when it comes to the basic set of fundamental rights for our workers, the 48 and 11 hours maximum legally mandated time for work and rest time mandated. Individuals in such working arrangements are also far more likely to report work intensification and declare that work is impacting negatively on their private life. Furthermore, home-based teleworkers are more likely to declare working in their free time. Such additional working time can be unpaid, resulting in long hours that again can contribute to physical and psychological health risks such as headaches, eye strains, stress, burnouts, also contributing to an absence and also reduced productivity on our workplaces. They can also negatively impact our work-life balance. Those trends also come with inherent risks for workers that basically may not be sufficiently covered by the Framework Directive and also by the European Framework Agreement on Telework, which was signed in 2002. And therefore, now we have at hand a number of important questions on how basically to strike the right balance between telework and digitalization, and on the other hand, safeguarding workers' rights in these new digital realities that we are living in. Some member states have already taken and have been proactive to take a number of steps to regulate this. But this is more the exception than the rule at the European level. Before the pandemic, there were differences between countries as regards the prevalence of the telework and also how we regulate the right to disconnect. And while the gaps have been reduced, it is very likely that in the post-pandemic world of work, in the hybrid work of work, where these will re-emerge again higher due to the different economic structures and also the development and enforcement of digital technologies, the culture of work, and also varying regulations. And that is why we, as the European legislators, have to act as soon as possible. Despite the importance of telework, there are currently no uniform regulations for their implementation, except for the European Framework Agreement of 2002, which only contains very general legal framework, not legally binding for the member states. Furthermore, we currently have the European also Framework Agreement of Telework for 2002, and also the Framework Agreement for Digitalization signed in 2020. However, the first one might not entirely be in line with the existing and also the future challenges of digital remote work, and the second one should be monitored as regards how far it is basically addressing the real challenges of the pandemic and the post-pandemic world of work. Moreover, there is no EU legislation providing for minimum working conditions in the telework or when it comes to the establishment of the right to disconnect, its definition, and also granting minimum sets of rights for workers. And since telework currently and not explicitly is regulated under union law, action at union level is needed to ensure that minimum requirements to protect all workers in the same way in the union, basically those workers who have an interaction or are using digital tools for work purposes are more specific, are safeguarded, and their fundamental rights are protected in the same way as the other traditional workers. The Commission, in its European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, is recognizing that while telework and the right to disconnect is offering opportunities, it is also raising the need to reflect more, for example, on the boundaries of contractual working time and also the balance between work and personal life. And in its action plan, the European Commission is basically inviting European social partners to find commonly agreed solutions that address the challenges that are raised by telework and explore measures to ensure fair working conditions. And in this light, developments that are happening and that have happened basically since the adoption of the Framework Agreement on Telework in 2002, we have therefore reached a pivotal period. And the lack of framework must be rectified if telework and the use of digital tools is to become the pervasive feature of our working lives. And that is why the European Parliament has adopted the resolution based on a legislative own initiative report on the right to disconnect. In this resolution, the European Parliament is basically setting out a number of requests to ensure that workers are able to exercise effectively their right to disconnect and the use of existing and new digital tools for work purposes. And to that end, the European Parliament is basically calling on the Commission to issue a directive on the right to disconnect and also on telework. And I'm going to conclude on this point. Given the challenges presented by significant increase of digital tools for work purposes, atypical employment relations and telework arrangements, in particular, in the context of the increase in telework and the use of digital tools that arose during the COVID crisis, and voluntary actions must definitely be complemented by legally binding solutions and uniform regulation that is applicable across the board in a uniform way in all our member states for the implementation of telework and also the right to disconnect at EU level.
Great. Thank you, Alex. What I wrote down from your talk is that you started off with the potential for businesses and business resilience, and that now is the time to look ahead to the future, but that we need to, that there are some concerns related to mental well-being, resting time, constant connection, work-life balance, and digital tools, and that there's therefore definitely a need for a uniform regulation that goes beyond the 2002 Telework framework to protect workers' fundamental rights. Thank you. All right, then before we go to our last speaker, I would like to invite the audience one last time to submit their questions on our Slido application, so www.slido using the code Telework. And then I would like to move to Joost. Joost, the current framework agreement on telework, as we've heard a few times now, dates from 2002. Given the progress, technological progress that we made in the last 20 years and this new post-COVID world, is that framework still sufficient for protecting workers and promoting flexible working in Europe?
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for having me. I'm much honored to be part of this important discussion. I think it's true, the framework agreement was concluded in 2002. It's almost 20 years ago. We had another look at it from time to time, and it's actually refreshingly modern and still very much up to date. It's quite surprising that 5 years before the iPhone came on the market, I think the iPhone came on the market in 2007. You'll never forget that Steve Jobs presented it. And so 5 years before, social partners already had this agreement, which contains all the essential elements, I think, that are important. It defines what telework is, it fixes a number of minimum rights, it makes a link with occupational health and safety, so health and safety in the workplace, and it even has rules already on data protection. That's even more astonishing, 14 years before the general data protection regulation entered into force. So I think we should start by saying, I would like to start by saying that I'm really impressed by what they've done. Now, of course, is this the end of it? No. I mean, it's clear that, and the previous speakers have given you ample evidence, things have moved on quite a lot, and that is why the social partners are indeed looking at this in the context of their work program. I mean, it's for them to see how far they get, but from our side, from the side of the Commission, we obviously encourage the social partners as much as we can to review and to update and to modernize. There's this other agreement that Mr. Saliba also referred to on the digitalization, which is from 2020, which also has a lot of important elements, in particular linked to this right to disconnect, which was mentioned a couple of times. So all of this is good, and I think from the side of the Commission we always much prefer, of course, if social partners take this forward themselves, but we don't shun, of course, away from our own responsibility. But it is true also, if you look at the member states, the situation is very much inspired by agreements between social partners and sometimes at the national level, but even going down to businesses. I mean, if I may say a few other words about sort of the general picture, also responding to the important contributions that we just heard. I mean, it's obvious that COVID-19 changed everything. I have a few figures here. In 2019, according to our estimates and our data, about 5% of Europeans were working from home. In April 2020, which was, I think, the height of the pandemic, the number jumped to 37%, so almost 40%. It's also important to note, as I think was said by both Renske and also Judy, that the situation differs a lot between member states. The starting point is very different, and the increase is also very different. For some countries, actually, there was almost no increase because they already had a high level of teleworking. Others, so there are clearly also a lot of cultural and national elements at play here, and we see this clearly from the figures. Another important number maybe for the discussion is that Eurofound, our agency in Dublin, which is extremely good at all this, at all the research, they have done an estimate research that shows that about 37% of the jobs in the EU are, let's say, teleworkable. So with 40% in April 2020 and 37% teleworkable, we're almost there, you would say. Yeah? It's difficult to see how you could go further just looking at the way work is organized at the moment. Of course, this can still be, it's also an important discussion. Can we maybe change the jobs and the working environment so that this figure goes up? Almost half of European workers, again, according to Eurofound, almost half, 47%, wish to continue working from home. So that is also, I think, a very, very important fact of life. Finally, it is very true, of course, as Mr. Saliba also said, that there are positive sides of teleworking. I think it is generally, for me certainly, a discovery how pleasant it can actually be to work from home, and it does take away a lot of stress, and you can have a very, very rewarding work balance life. But there are also, of course, major threats and challenges. And that's why the discussion on the right to disconnect, in a way, how can we overcome the distrust that is still very much there on the side of the employers? We just heard, how can we remove that? So this is an interesting and very important discussion that we're taking forward. You will see in 2022 from the side of the Commission, and again, very much inspired by the good work that Mr. Saliba has been doing in the Parliament with the resolution, some important initiatives will be taken. Also to understand better what is happening, to promote social dialogue on this. We're going to organize conferences, we're doing a big study. And we're also coming back towards the end of the year, we do a report on the Working Time Directive, which is obviously a key piece of legislation from the European Union, where we were looking at developments and whether what they mean for the Working Time Directive are key.
Thank you, Joost. What I took away is that the telework framework, although old, is still surprisingly modern, but also that you are happy to take this forward with the social partners. So I was glad to hear that, and I found it very interesting, your remark about what we can do to make more jobs teleworkable. I also thought that was an interesting contribution to the discussion, especially since I see the questions coming in from the audience. There's this question from Catherine, who says that despite its challenges, hybrid work is still a privilege of the middle class. What will happen to the inequality gap if hybrid work becomes the new normal? And I would like to add on that, because we have been indeed focusing mostly on the risks for the teleworkers and the fair treatment of the workers who are working remotely. But what about the on-site workers? So the on-site workers, like Catherine says in her question, they're usually more highly educated, more well-paid, have more autonomy. So the ones who are stuck in the office or on-site are lower in the hierarchy, and now they also lose out on the flexibility that their colleagues can benefit from. And that can contribute not only to economic inequality, but also within organizations to these feelings of unfairness in the organization. So let me ask this question to our two business representatives here. How can employers make sure that on-site workers don't get even more disadvantaged when we move to this hybrid way of working? Renske, do you want to go first?
Yeah, there's two sides to this coin, of course. On the I see Julie already nodding. On the one hand, and I think Julie commented on that, I recognized everything you said, by the way, Julie, in your presentation. There's this, the closer, how do you say, the closer you are, in Dutch you say the closer you are, the more loved you are, so to speak. So what's being seen in the office, if we then speak about people who can at all work either from home or so who do have the choice to do this, then indeed there's the fear, and I think it's not ungrounded, that it will be more easy to progress possibly in your career than when you always have to work from home. But then there's also the fact, I think that's quite a large one, and if we look at the 37% of jobs that are teleworkable, if I have the right percentage, then that also means that there are a lot of jobs where people simply do not have the choice to work from home, and they have to go on site. And that indeed, there you go back to the issue of equity, which I think will indeed become an issue. So I do understand that question of the privilege of the middle class. There are a lot of workers who simply don't have the opportunity, which I think is the bigger issue actually.
Thanks, Julie. Julie, would you?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting perspective, because I think a lot of the research out there, certainly from other business psychologists, is that you are more disadvantaged by being remote because your performance isn't being seen, and things like promotion isn't just about what you do, it's also how you do it and interact with people. And that point I made slightly earlier about present privilege is, you know, we're seeing that people are having access to senior leaders and senior managers that they wouldn't have otherwise done, because they're in offices on different work patterns that they're seeing people. I mean, one of the organizations we work with, the most senior manager, in fact, the CEO, decided that they were going to work from a hub office because it was closer to their home. So the whole power dynamic of the business completely altered because of they had decided to do this. So I think most of the research actually says it's disadvantaged the other way, that those that aren't in the office don't get as many opportunities, they aren't seen, their performance isn't seen as well. So it's a very interesting perspective to do that. But I totally agree that, you know, the people that can telework do tend to have sort of, you know, if you work in a retail shop, you cannot work from home. If you are the receptionist, you cannot work from home. So there will be this kind of balance of making sure that nobody is disadvantaged. And the way that leaders will need to do that is to really keep in touch with their people, whether they see them in the office or whether they see them remotely. That it will be always about checking in, how are you doing, making sure that you're sharing the opportunities equally across those that are in the office and those that aren't.
Thank you, Julie. I would like to continue on this topic of DEI and diversity, equity, and inclusion, but moving on to the gender aspect, which hasn't been highlighted so much yet. So hybrid work is impacting women differently than men. On the one hand, women still take up more care work at home on average, and telework can help them achieve a better work-life balance. On the other hand, when telework is taken up disproportionately by women, like you say, they will lose out on this visibility at work, and they will lose out on career opportunities that their male colleagues might benefit from, and that could exacerbate the gender divide and the pay gap. So I wanted to address this question to Joost. Joost, are policymakers worried about the gender impact of hybrid work? Is that a dimension that policy is reflecting on?
Definitely, I think this is something of concern and something that needs to be taken into account when policies are devised. I think this question, like the earlier question you put about the 37% and what about the others, essentially are also management issues. I think if management is aware of it and if they realize the perception this may create, I think this already an important part of the answer. I think anyway that the biggest responsibility to make all this work is actually on the shoulders of the managers, and not necessarily the CEOs. I think CEOs have an enormous role, of course, to be the model and to show and to give the right instruction. But it is much more, I think, at a lower level. If I look at my own organization, I mean, we're also quite a big director general. It's almost 40 units, so 40 heads of units, and I think that's where the change will have to come from. And they need to operate in this new world where people may come to the office once or twice a week, 2 days a week. I think the Commission is orienting towards 2 days a week. And how do you then organize? And why would people want to come to the office on this or that day? You need to make it also attractive for them to come. There needs to be a reason to come. And so I think it's there. And then in that context, I think these issues of gender and equity need to be taken really, really seriously. And this is something that, at least in my own organization, is very prominently present in the discussions.
Yeah. So when you said that this responsibility falls on the shoulders of the managers, I saw our two managers nodding in the screen. However, I kind of wanna go a bit further on this. So we do see that there's this trend that the labor market is on fire. You know, there's this great resignation. People are quitting their jobs. Workers are gaining bargaining power in the labor market, and companies are competing for workers in this war for talent. So telework is one of those dimensions that firms are competing on for workers. And I want to ask all of you this question. Do you really think that the market will reach a fair way of organizing hybrid work and taking into account this diversity DEI aspect, or do we need policy interventions to make sure that this new hybrid equilibrium stays fair and inclusive? Yours.
Who to start? Yes. I don't think this happens by default. I'm not that naive. I think. Even though if you look at the facts again, if people were all rational, we would have to do it, and we should do it because of the new challenges posed by teleworking, but also because of the survival of our social market economy. If you look at the long-term trends, they haven't really changed. I mean, of course, COVID-19 was a life-marking event for many people, including for myself. Never experienced anything alike. It is at the end of the day maybe a pressure cooker that made things more obvious, but things were there anyway, and they will continue. And here I'm talking about the demographic decline, about competition, about globalization, about the shrinking relevance of the European Union and its model. I think it's really being challenged. So in order to keep our very high standard of prosperity, we will have to change. And one of the biggest changes is, of course, to make it to increase female participation in the workplace. That is, I think, the most important challenge that we all agree on, and where we need to move on. And I think here again, teleworking, it's more like look at it from the positive side. I think it helps, provided we don't make any stupid mistakes. It will help. Same with integration in the labor market of people with a migrant background. And we cannot afford the luxury to sort of waste all that potential. People with disabilities, another one. There is a big task ahead of all of us, which again has been made more clear again with COVID-19, but has essentially not changed, I think. On the labor market competition and the shortage of labor, it's a bit too early, I think, to conclude whether this is something that will last or whether we are more in a process of transition and coping with the immediate aftermath of the COVID. In itself, I find it not bad that there's competition for labor. It helps. In Germany, they've already decided to increase minimum wage. I think even before the government is there, the minimum wage goes up to 12 euros. So this is, I think, a very good development. And if that were to continue, I wouldn't be against it.
Great. So a positive, although slightly cautious view from Joost. Now I would like to ask the same question to our two business women. So I saw you nodding when Joost said that the responsibility falls on the shoulders of the employers to make sure that telework is implemented in a fair and inclusive way. But so I know from a personal perspective you agree, but when you think about the market of firms, do you think all of them will spontaneously move to a hybrid way of working that is inclusive and fair in our European society? So maybe Jenske, I see you are ready to go. Yeah.
Julie probably is ready to go as well. So that's probably not a criterion. Well, first of all, I think we always have to remember that managers are people too. It's very important to keep in the back of our heads. And all managers often report into a manager themselves. So it's human behavior that is really key to try and consciously influence here. But I do think that employers, because I do think that the war for talent that we have seen coming for quite a while is intensifying now, and that can also be explained by certain demographic phenomena, of course. And I agree that it also offers definitely opportunities to have more integration of indeed the minorities that are not participating in the workforce as much now as we want to. We cannot waste that potential. And in that war for talent, I am quite convinced, and we see our clients also definitely moving in that direction, and we do that ourselves as well, to make sure that we are attractive employers, because indeed we have to make it attractive for people to come to work, but we also have to make ourselves, and organizations have to make themselves attractive to work for, more attractive than other companies. And I think offering especially that autonomy, I think that Julie also commented on, and not taking that back again. So making sure that people can, and we call it in Randstad, at their best. So indeed, that people can, for themselves as much as possible, that managers give them the opportunity to decide where to do what type of activities. And that can even differ from one individual to another. An example is, for instance, in our branches, sometimes you have to do, as we say, cold sales. That means calling up clients that you haven't worked with before. There are employees who really like to do that from home, because there they set their mind to it and they can do that in their own cadence. While there are others who say, I really want to do this in the office with a number of peers, colleagues who do exactly the same. Some of them are really good at it. I'm not so good at it. And I like to be next to someone who's better at this, just as an example. And there you want to cater for, as a manager, that part of your team do these activities from home and others do that in a team setting. And by indeed having those type of conversations, so trying out something together, say, what does the organization need? What do we as a team need? And then as a manager have individual conversations. What do you need? And how can I cater for that? Trying that out for 6 weeks and then do the cadence again. Say, okay, did this work? Does this work from an organizational, team and individual perspective? Indeed, it's an iterative process. But yes, I do think this will be part of being an attractive employer, having that autonomy and being able to get your work-life balance as much as possible tailored to your own individual preferences. And they are individual, I think. Yeah, that helps.
Thank you, Renske. So also a positive outlook on employers making themselves attractive for workers. Julie, what's your perspective on this issue?
Yeah, I agree totally with what Penske was saying, but I think a couple of other things just to think about is that from an employer's perspective, actually having flexibility of recruitment and having remote working is actually a benefit, because it gives you this wider pool to actually acquire your talent from. I mean, you know, I work in Cambridge, which is a lot of people, but actually because of where we're based, we've tended to have people who can travel to Cambridge on occasions. Whereas now you can have a wider base. One of the companies we were working with very recently, actually talking about their hybrid principles, how they were going to apply them, actually said, this means that we actually don't need to employ in the UK anymore. If we find the right talent is in Holland or in Germany, because we have this hybrid way of working, we can now absolutely increase our talent pool. I think it is going to be really important for people going forward. I think one of the key things around about leadership as well is actually modeling the behavior that you want to have. So if the organization says come in 2 days a week, that's great, but don't come in the same 2 days a week every time, because that's when everyone else will come in as well. So you need to really get leaders who are modeling this behavior and being inclusive. And I think actually monitoring is going to be a big thing. How are we treating the people who work from home? You know, how are we treating men and women? How are we treating people with disabilities? So some monitoring to actually understand that we are being fair in, you know, the promotion activities, being on the good projects, you know, being connected into the organization is going to be really important going forward. But I think this, having the flexibility is going to be something that will differentiate good employers and great employers.
Great, thank you, Julie. So I take away the need for training actually managers in organizations for having this perspective of diversity and inclusion when they are managing a hybrid team. And I want to pick up on something else that you said on having this wider pool for talent to draw from. Because we have also 2 questions from the audience who are relating to this this aspect of having a wider pool, geographic mobility across Europe. So I'm going to read out 2 of those. What about the opportunities of remote work, the big freedoms of a borderless Europe? How can the Commission facilitate this? What does it do internally? From an anonymous person. And then we also have one of our senior fellows, Mario Mariniello, who's asking to Joost, to what extent is the emergence of the EU digital nomads a challenge or an opportunity for a single market integration? So these 2 questions relate to geographic mobility of workers in Europe that could benefit this hybrid work, and what the Commission's views are on that.
Good. Yeah, so indeed, I think, honestly, we are entering here, breaking new ground. As Julie says, in fact, the whole idea of people crossing borders, which is at the heart of the whole EU single market project, is in a way being contested here, because people do no longer move. They stay where they are, and then they perform services or they work for somebody else in another member state. So this is not so easy to give you a clear-cut answer to. What we do realize, of course, that it is indeed putting a bit in question arrangements. Let me give you one example, which is a very real example, and it's bothering us a lot. When you look at quite a substantial group of European citizens who move across the border every day, or at least 3 or 4 days a week, the so-called border frontier workers, it's called, I think, in English, frontier workers. The rule is that they are paying their taxes and are insured social security in the country where they work. But that is only valid if they don't stay more than 25% of their working time in their country of residence. So if somebody has a house in Germany and comes into the Netherlands, but he stays more than 25% of his working time in Germany, then in fact the rule no longer applies. And we now already have letters of companies who are, of course, in border areas where people move around all the time. And because of teleworking now, the 25% is actually quite difficult to respect, the maximum 25%. So this is something that we really need to help solving. But in itself, again, on the other side, I think the fact that people no longer need to move and can still be productive and contribute and in a single market is a great thing. Not least for the Fit for 55, the green agenda, but also again I think for people's lives and work-life balance. Finally, my third point is. There is another debate ongoing, and we see it, for instance, now also in the context of platform work, which we are now preparing the initiative for December of this year, where, of course, governments and authorities would quite like to know a bit more about these economic activities. What does it mean for the tax base? Where are you actually insured? I think these questions are actually very relevant. It's all right if you're a brilliant IT specialist, you can be in any country and work anywhere else, but what about people who are, again, maybe less privileged, and then they have an accident, and then what happens? So you need to always be clear, and this is, I think, the essential part of the work of the Commission and the legislator, make sure that the rights of the people are not affected by these, the minimum rights are not affected by these, in themselves, I think, very promising developments.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that the improving the geographic mobility will certainly benefit the implementation of hybrid working. I saw our 2 business ladies who are joining us remotely nodding again. So Renske, you are also a multinational company who is employing people all over the world directly and indirectly. What are your experiences with this 25% rule and the challenges that it brought now that you are working in a hybrid way?
Well, I recognize it very much, and indeed we do have workers that work in different locations, and where we monitor very closely how much they do work in what location, and that gives us, I think, especially as we're saying, or as I said, maybe that we want to be an attractive employer, and I think organizations want to be an attractive employer. And at the same time, I think it's very important, and also for Randstad, it's important not only for our own workers, but for the workers, the candidates that work for all of our clients, that we are a fair employer and indeed have insurance issues, as an example, well captured. So for us, that is one of the most important things we want to do right. And you do see that sometimes in the markets where we are present, that not for us, but it is blurring for others. And that's not something that we are very happy about. So getting clarity on how that will be in the future is an important thing. On the other hand, it also gives us opportunities for big clients that do say we need a great number of workers, for instance, in logistics, working for us. And we were formerly in an environment where the talent pipeline was not so deep, that now we can advise based on data on organizing that work differently in parts of the world where the talent pipeline is deeper, because employees don't have to travel anymore. But I do recognize that it is a challenge also for our workers that want to work for, and then I speak for people who work for Randstad themselves again, who say I want to work for a number of days from another country. And we have limited that at the moment, especially for those reasons, because we want to make sure that we're very clear on the number of days that you do work abroad, and that we don't exceed that, and we don't get into any issues with paying tax or being insured. But those two trends, well, I can see that probably won't be sustainable for the next few years. So that needs to be looked at, I think.
Julie, you're joining us from the UK, which has then its own challenges since the Brexit.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you share with us some of your perspective on this geographic mobility internationally and hybrid working?
Yeah, I mean, yes, as you say, we have challenges for our clients. I think it's something they're really just looking at. We have quite a number of international, multinational clients who are looking at this issue, and they have been discussing the relevance of tax, etc. So I think it's something new that they're really just sort of thinking about and really getting to grips with. I think slightly differently, one of the things we're also seeing is making sure there's no judgment on why people are working remotely, because we've had discussions with people when we've been simulating how their hybrid will be working, where we've had people saying, well, I've got caring responsibilities, so I want to work teleworking. We've got other people who are saying, well, I've got a holiday home, and actually a friend of mine has a holiday home in France, and so he sort of says, well, I'm going to work from my holiday home Thursday and Friday. And actually, if you're going to offer hybrid working, you can't judge why people are using it as long as they are delivering. So the conversations we're having are, yes, then they're getting to grips with that, but also from a management perspective of, you cannot place a value judgment on why people are working remotely. And actually that's going to be one of the things which is about the fairness as well, is you can't say that my reason for teleworking is any better or any worse than somebody else's.
Great, thank you. We are approaching the end of the time that we had for this event. I think we had a really interesting discussion. I would like to invite all of you to just say in one sentence what you think is the most important thing that European policy should be doing related to hybrid work. So I'll start with the business people, and then Joost can have one final sentence on that. So maybe Renske first. If there's one thing that Joost should take away to his office after today, what should that be, in your opinion?
Wow, I find that a hugely difficult question. on all of the other things, I thought, can't wait to give but the most important thing, well, I do think it is the equity issue, making sure, and there's, as we already discussed, different elements to it, but making sure that people have as equal access to work as possible, and having that reflected in legislation, however difficult that is, by the way, because I definitely realize that. I think that for me would be the most important thing.
Great, thank you. Julie, what's your final say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would build on what Penska's been saying, but mine would be about reporting. It's actually to encourage organisations to actually report on some of these things, to make them open, because I think by doing that, you put attention, so you get what you measure, and I think it's going to be really important to actually sort of encourage them to say how they are doing this, how are they working with remote workers, what is the career progression. So some of those metrics, which are probably not things that organisations would think about measuring, but some of the things that will actually show how effectively hybrid working is working for them and not reinforcing any discrimination.
Great, thank you, Julie. So you used equity, diversity, and measuring.
Yes, I think that sums it up rather nicely. I mean, I can just say that in the meeting in Porto in May of this year, the leaders of the European Union, so the highest level we have, I think, agreed on a text that also picks up this element. And I think the bottom line is that these developments, whether we like it or not, are happening. And many of these developments are actually good. It's also progress. But what we must avoid at the EU level is that through these developments, the level of protection of the weakest, in a way, and many times they are the workers are the weakest, that they suffer. So I think this has always been, in a way, the way that the European Union has been working. There has to be a sort of a minimum level below which nobody can sink. And member states should obviously stay well below this level. The higher, the better. And I think this is what we're trying to do with all the proposals that are going to come and that are already there on the table.
Great, thank you. So I would like to thank all the panelists for their interesting contributions today. Also Alex, unfortunately, who had to leave early because he had a double booking. But Julie, Renske, Joost, thank you for being here today. And thank you, the audience, for the questions that you raised. And I hope you enjoyed this event. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.